Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning or good evening, perhaps, depending on where you are. And welcome to the third webinar of the Standing Committee for Gender Equality in Science. My name is Catherine Jamy. I am a researcher at the French CNRS, and I am the chair of the Standing Committee for Gender Equality in Science. The acronym is SCGES, so let me explain to you what SCGES is. It is an independent committee founded in 2020 by 9 international scientific organizations, most of which are full members of the International Science Council. These founding partners had worked together on the ISC-supported project called A Global Approach to the Gender Gap in Mathematical, Computing and Natural Sciences, how to measure it, how to reduce it. This project became known as the Gender Gap in Science Project. Today, SCGES has 19 partners, most of which are ISC International Union members. They represent millions of scientists brought together across disciplines to promote gender equality in science. The aim of SCGES is to ensure liaison amongst international scientific unions to foster gender equality and the implementation of recommendations of the Gender Gap in Science project, especially in the scientific communities that the scientific unions represent. SCGES has also issued recommendations to safeguard gender equality in science in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. We actively cooperate with policymakers and international organizations, first and foremost ISC, for the promotion of gender equality in science. In our work, we strive to take into account the diversity of the discipline of women around the world and across disciplines, but also to understand what various disciplines represented amongst us can bring to, in terms of analysis and actions, proposals for actions to our promotion of gender equality in science. So for our third webinar, it is the International Union of Psychological Sciences, IUPsyS, one of our members, who is offering perspectives from the discipline it represents. Before giving the floor to our speaker today, let me share some information on you, the audience who has registered to join this session. Next slide, please. So as of yesterday, when these statistics were compiled, we had 157 persons registered to this webinar. As I speak, there are, I think, more than 200. As you can see on this map, the majority of you are in Asia, which is pleasing as we strive to reach all scientists around the world rather than remain Euro or North America centered. Next slide, please. As to gender, about 3/4 of participants have said they are women, while about 2/3 of the rest have preferred not to specify their gender. We hope to reach and involve male colleagues as well as females and those who perceive themselves as other genders as our activity develops. Next slides, please. So regarding disciplines, about 50% of those who have given an indication are psychologists. But as you can see, a large number of colleagues from other disciplines are interested in what psychologists have to report about the situation in their discipline. Next slide, please. Finally, the audience is at all stages of their career. This indicates that the topic of gender equality is of interest to scientists and people in related profession, whatever the stage of their career. Now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Pamela Maras, the president of IUPsyS, who will introduce the topic, the speakers, and then chair this session. Pamela, over to you.
So if we could have the first slide, please. Hi, it's really good to be here, and I'd also like to start by thanking Catherine Jamy, who is chair of the Standing Committee, for gender equality in science, for facilitating this, and also for leading the committee, which is doing really important work. I'd also like to start by thanking Marie-Francois Roy, Carol Woodward, Luciana Santa Maria, and Carl Swain for the support they're giving to this webinar. And that support is invaluable, although you may not see them on the screen. My name is Pam Morass. I'm a professor of social and educational psychology at the University of Greenwich, although I'm emeritus now. And I'm going to be introducing the International Union of Psychological Science and then the speakers, because I think the eminence of them will mean that you'll want to hear more from them than you do from me. I'd just like to start by saying that gender and issues around gender are central for very much of the psychological research that goes on, and indeed the practice of psychology. Indeed, my own early research looked at gender as an issue in many instances in relation to adolescence. And we found that, for example, this is a small finding and I'm not going to say any more about it, other than when we looked at girls' and boys' choice and liking for STEM subjects, we found that actually girls in single-sex schools scored higher than girls in mixed-sex schools, and boys in mixed-sex schools scored higher than boys in single-sex schools. So that in itself indicates that this is a very complex subject, which is really important. Can we have the next slide, please? Right, I'm going to start by saying something about the International Union of Psychological Science. The acronym is IUPsyS. We have over 90 national members, and that represents over 2 million psychologists worldwide. Our power is in our collaboration. So we collaborate with the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and of course the International Science Council, of which we're a full member and always have been. And we also have a community of regional members that represent the regions across the globe, from the Arab Union of Psychological Societies, the ASEAN Regional Union of Psychological Societies, the Asia Pacific Psychology Alliance, and then I'm sorry, but there's a bit of a blob on the slide, but it's the European Federation of Psychologist Associations, the Pan-African Psychology Union, and the Union of Colleges and Associations of Psychology in Central America. So we have breadth. And our power is in our collaboration, but also in our ability to be able to collate information and forward information from all of those regions. Could I have the next slide, please? We are the global voice of psychology, and our mission is to serve psychology for science and to serve humanity. And the obvious place where you would start thinking about that, of course, would be the UN Development Goals. And indeed, an awful lot of the goals relate to the work of scientists and indeed practitioners in psychology across the globe. Could I have the next slide, please? We have, as all international organisations do, some statutes, but I'd like to just draw your attention to the end of this statute, which is the one I think that relates most to this particular webinar. So we look at the benefits and access to data, information and research material, but we actively uphold the principle by opposing any discrimination on the basis of such factors as ethnic origin, religion, citizenship, language, political stance, gender, sex or sexual orientation, or indeed age. Can I have the next slide, please? Just to say something briefly about psychology. Psychology is a STEM subject. It's always been a STEM subject. However, it has always been located both in science, so in the International Science Council, but also in the human behaviour sciences. So we were also a member of the International Social Science Council, but we are a full member and always have been of the International Science Council. It's internationally valid scientific discipline that recognises the importance of context and practice. And I think when you hear our speakers, you'll realise how important that is. We have very rigorous scientific methods, and empirical rigour is central to our science and indeed to the publications that arise from psychology. But we also have the skills to lead and collaborate with other disciplines, and also the ability to identify psychological processes underlying behaviour and relate them to targeted interventions, much of which happens in the practice of psychology as well as in the science of psychology. The important point to remember is that we have an understanding of membership of groups or categories, whatever that might be, and that we're very aware that when we do research that those categories can be transient, they can be stable, or they can cross different categories. We also have an ethical framework and an academic and professional competencies and standards. And that ethical framework really underpins all of psychology, the science, the practice, the publications, and indeed the standards. Can I have the next slide, please? In terms of psychology and gender across the globe, as a broad rule, initially, as with many disciplines in science and indeed in other areas, the practitioners, the students, the leaders were male. But actually, for a number of years, the students or the more junior roles have been predominantly or mainly female, and the more senior roles male. And that's changing. That's changing fast. But that differs across the world. And again, I think that's important to remember as an international organisation. We have to be aware there are differences across the world. I can say, though, that I'm the first female president of the International Union of Psychological Science. And at this time, our Secretary General is female and our Treasurer is female. So that's a good sign. Because if you don't change leadership, then you won't change anything else. So gender is a topic of scientific investigation in psychology. It's a topic that both is essential to investigation, but also more in terms of the way that other aspects are looked at. Can I have the next slide, please? And this is my last slide before I introduce our speakers, but I think it's an important slide. It actually relates particularly to our first speaker, but also to our second speaker, that gender is not a unique, freestanding category. There's intersectionality. It crosses lots of boundaries, borders, lives beside lots of boundaries and borders, to do with privilege, to do with all sorts of dimensions, that some of which are on here. And I think that if we don't remember that, certainly in our psychology research, then we may come unstuck. Certainly poverty, certainly responsibilities, those issues are often linked to certain genders. In this case, we're talking about female. The other thing to recognise and note is that we all decide on what pronouns we use to describe ourselves. And we see that as an important point. But the point of this webinar is to look at it just in terms of female. But we recognise the importance of choice of pronoun for whoever, either a scientist or a non-scientist, decides to speak. So without further ado, I'd like to move on and say something about our speakers. So if I could have the next slide, that would be good. So we've got a programme of two very esteemed speakers who take different approaches, or different approaches, who take a different perspective in looking at gender. And we're going to hear from each of them in turn. Details, biographic details, and the abstracts of their talks are on the website. We're going to hear each of them in turn, and we'll have questions and discussion at the end so that we have a free flow of the talks. I will introduce each in turn. Our first speaker will be Vidya Idziti, who's going to talk about gender equality in psychology, an intersectional feminist perspective from India. After which, Isabel Rainier is going to talk about the influence of gender stereotypes on cognitive performance and hiring decisions. Very different talks, both of which are really important, offer some perspectives. So, and then we'll have some questions and discussion. So I'm going to ask Vidya to take over in a minute. But before I do, I'm going to say a little bit about her, because I'm sure she's far too modest to do this. And we're very lucky to have her speaking. She's a former professor of psychology at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Hyderabad in India. Her research concerns are located in the interface of psychology and feminism, focusing on gender-based violence, women's mental health, trafficking of women, and the psychology of women's political activism, all of which are really crucial. Her publications include the co-edited Handbook of International Perspectives on Feminism, Psychology, Women, Culture and Rights, which won the 2012 Distinguished Publication Award from the Association of Women in Psychology in the USA. She has a South Asian Visiting Fellowship from the University of Oxford and is part of visiting faculty in the Universities of Gothenburg in Sweden, Evos in Lausanne University in Hungary, and she was past president of the National Academy of Psychology in India. So we're very, very lucky to have her. So without more ado, I'll hand over to Vizan. She'll give her talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I have the first slide, please? Okay. So hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those who are tuning in to these talks from different locations and from different time zones. First, a very warm thank you to the Standing Committee on Gender Equality in Science and the International Union for Psychological Science, represented today by its first woman president in 133 years, Professor Pam Maras, for giving me this opportunity to speak in this webinar and to contribute in a small way to these kinds of critical conversations about gender equity in education and social change. As I have been introduced already, I will delve directly into my topic, which is to present an intersectional feminist perspective from India on gender equality in psychology. In putting together this presentation, two of my former colleagues, Dr. Nalini Bikkina and Dr. Sunaina Swain, helped me to get some of the data, and I would like to acknowledge with thanks the inputs given by them. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, before beginning my presentation, I would like to make some disclaimers. One, that the presentation is not really based on an exhaustive or even a comprehensive collection of data. We were actually hampered by the lack of a national database on gender composition in psychology, and particularly with intersecting parameters of social disadvantage. Therefore, the phrase intersectional feminist perspective that I use has more to do with the conceptual lens that I adopt to view the state of gender equality in psychology, and actually less to do with actual figures. But then I have been teaching psychology and so last 5 years. So it is also based on my slides. Next slide, please. Okay, so what I would like to do in the next 30-35 minutes is to begin with a very brief historical overview of the emergence and growth of psychology in India, just to kind of provide a context, followed by showing you some data on gender composition, particularly in terms of student enrollment, faculty positions, and so on in psychology. And then I go on to make two overarching arguments or observations, fairly going through a feminization, of the discipline. And this is a trend perhaps similar to many countries across the world. It's not unique to India, but still it's happening. So one is this feminization. And the second is the continuance of socio-cultural barriers, particularly to women's employment. Before wrapping up, I would like to talk about a recent initiative implemented by the University Grants Commission, which is the highest regulatory body of education in India. This particular initiative ran for more than a decade across all regions and universities, uh, specifically to facilitate, to encourage women to take up academic institutional leadership positions for bringing about gender parity and equity in educational institutions. Though this initiative wasn't specific to psychology as such, I'm taking this example because it is grounded in affirmative social policy framework, and I certainly feel similar programs can make a difference in ameliorating gender disparities in higher education. And I will conclude by emphasizing on need for greater research and interventions in this field. Next slide, please. My presentation is grounded broadly in a feminist social justice framework, wherein, as Pam just now said, the category woman is not merely perceived as a binary characteristic, but is located in the intersections of gender with other markers of social disadvantage, such as caste in India, which is one of the most pernicious systems of social disadvantage in India, caste, ethnicity, and disability in particular. But of course, as I said in my disclaimer earlier, with limited data available, the intersectional perspective reflects the conceptual lens I have adopted, and I don't really have so much of data to back my argument. Yes, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. So I would like to begin with this quote from Florence Denmark, the American psychologist, also a pioneering figure in women's studies. Way back in 1998, she had remarked that relatively little is known regarding women's current status in psychology in countries beyond the United States and Canada. Such a remark, although made in way back in 1998, I suppose it holds good even today, because except for countries like, say, for example, South Africa, the rest, particularly South Asia, remains the dark continent. And though I initially wanted to include South Asia, for now, for this presentation, I'm focusing on India, essentially for reasons of time. Yeah, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Sorry about that. Yeah, it's come now. So to set the context, I would like to begin.
Hi. We seem to have Vidai seems to have lost her her connection. So while this isn't my area, I will continue to take you through the slides, and then as she comes back, she can pick it up. I think that's the best thing to do here. So, and also, of course, the slides are available, will be available on our website. So she was talking about the emergence of modern scientific psychology in India, and it emerged as part of the colonial system of education, first being established in Calcutta University in 1915, which is actually quite a long time ago. And but it involved the adoption of a positivist model of science, parallel to the interest of psychoanalysis, which in Europe was more prevalent, in line with the work of Freud. In the accounts of psychology at that time, there was no mention of women in historical contexts in that early period, but indeed there probably wasn't in many areas of psychology across the globe, except of course in Freud's analytic work as patients. The first woman to receive the PhD was from Calcutta University, and what Vinay suggests, in line with Kumar 2011, is there's a dichotomy of natural sciences inspired by male scientists, teachers and students, and followers were largely women. And that reflects the point I made at the very beginning. That's kind of a global thing. The followers were women, and the actual scientists, the people who had the knowledge or claimed to have the knowledge, were men. Can we have the next slide, please? Post the 1947 in the context of independence, education was seen as really important in terms of the idiom of progress and modernity. Progress and modernity was something that arose following 1947 independence in India. And there was an exponential growth then in higher education generally, from 606 colleges and universities to, gosh, 51,649, which is a huge increase. And from 0.18 million students to 37.4 million, of which 49% are women. And again, I will note Vendaya's comment that, of course, she can only draw on the data that's available. And from 24,000 to 1.5 million faculties, of which 42.5% were faculty. So it seemed as if there were faculty members who were women, not half, but 42.5% is quite a large half. High. In terms of the way that Vendaya, and again, I'm using her slides, so it's her view that's important here. Women's education was seen as an indicator of human social development and part of a national policy of programs. So being educated was something that was really important developmentally, and indeed in terms of human capacity. Can I have the next slide, please? And that also points out some paradoxes here. The paradoxes are throughout the world, indeed, not just in terms of gender, but in many studies that are of this kind when we're looking at groups and categories. So India is ranked 140 out of 156 countries for gender equality. That comes from the Global Gender Gap Report, WEF 2021. And a low number of participation of women in the workforce, of being 27%. What Vendaya suggests is that, in line with Chatterjee 2018 and colleagues, women's education has a U-shaped relationship with the women WFP, and the underrepresentation of women amongst higher education faculty, particularly at senior levels. And again, whilst it might be more pronounced in India, that's not an unusual situation to find. However, she suggests there's a steady increase in the proportion of women enrolled in higher education, despite this gender gap, this overall gender gap. And in STEM fields, the female proportion is 42%, while it is only 33% in the United States, which again is an interesting statistic, which we shouldn't forget, and which we should remember when we're making judgments about the prevalence of gender equality or indeed inequality. And it's the 5th largest research producer. That's India is a 5th largest research producer, and that's using Scopus data from 2017. Shall we have the next slide, please? As I say, when she comes back, I will, and when Vendaya comes back, I will hand back to her if she can get back. She's obviously had a bad connection. What you've got here, and again, I'll have to put my glasses on because I can't see the slides, but what you've got here.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you're back. I'm going to hand back to you, fortunately, because it's the slides. So we got to the slides. I started to go through the slides, and you're on this slide that's on the screen now. Okay? You want to come, put your picture back up, I'll come off. So, Vendaya, can you hear us now? We've got the slides on the screen on the gender distribution of MA, MPhil and PhD programs. Okay, well, I'll try and take you through these, but I think actually just looking at them, they are pretty pronounced. Again, I'll put my glasses on. What she has here, what Vendaya has here, is the distribution of MPhil, MA, PhD programs from 2010 to 2020, with the light bar, the lighter coloured bar, being male in all of the slides, and the dark, oh no, in the first slide, so the one on your right hand side, the one MA, the darker bars are male and the lighter bars are female. So in terms of MA, as across the the years from 2019 to back to 2010, there are more female MA students than male. If you look to MPhil, which is this slide on your left-hand side, at the top there, the lighter bars are female and the darker bars are male. And there you can see, again, a similar sort of picture. And then on the bottom row, again, you see a similar sort of picture, assuming that the darker bars are female. So indeed, across all India, a survey of higher education in 2020 showed that... Oh, she's back.
Can I?
Yeah. So Vinda, do you want to take this back?
Yeah, if you can hear me, sorry, I don't know what was the problem.
We can hear you, so the slides are up. You want to take us through the slides here?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah.
We can hear you.
Okay, fine. I'm very sorry about this problem, but I just don't know what happened. Right, so can we please go back to the previous slide? Can we go back to the, yeah, yes, I think this is done. The next one, next one, please. Can I have the next one, please? Okay, I think one slide got mixed, but anyway, what I was about to say is that in this particular slide, you can see these figures refer to the gender distribution in MA, MPhil, and PhD programs in psychology in the past 10 years. And as you can see, the long bars all represent women. So clearly, women are outnumbering male students in all the programs, beginning with the masters to MPhil to doctoral programs. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I can't see the slide. Yeah. So this is a picture of the distribution of gender and social disadvantage of psychology students in a public university. As you can see, although this was figures relating only to one public university, we just wanted to say that a striking feature is that there is, of course, a growing minority of men in keeping with the general trend. But what is very significant is that there has been an increasing representation of women from socially disadvantaged groups. And by socially disadvantaged groups, I mean those groups which refer to caste, ethnicity, and disability in particular. So this is a welcome feature. As I said, this may be data only from one university. And the reason why we took a public university is because public universities are, again, mandated to have affirmative social justice policies to reserve some seats in proportion to their population in universities. So this is the kind of picture of gender and social disadvantage of psychology students in a public university in the past 10 years. May I have the next slide, please? Can I have the next slide, please? I'm not able to see the slide. No, sorry, I'm not able to see it.
I think it's the slide gender imbalance in faculty positions, but large pool at entry level of entire.
Yes, but I'm not able to.
Late to you. I think they're coming up late.
Okay, so should I just continue speaking?
Yes, I think you should. Yeah.
Okay. So a third indicator we took was faculty positions currently held in psychology in 522 public funded universities across India. And as you can see, there is a gender imbalance with the proportion of men higher at the professor level. But what is interesting is at the entry level, there is a fairly large pool of women as assistant professors. And of course, it remains to be seen what kind of change is likely to take place in the coming years. Can I have the next slide, please?
This slide is the Indian Association of Clinical Psychologists.
Right. Let me just guess what is there on the slide. So this is the profile of clinical psychologists. Yes, there it is. This is the profile of clinical psychologists registered with the only professional association of clinical psychologists, Indian Association of Clinical Psychologists, set up in 1968. And as you can see from the picture here, those who have been conferred as fellows are a majority of women at 78%, but the proportion is very small when it comes to leadership positions, such as president of the organization, with women presidents being only 15% in its long history of more than half a century. Next slide, please. Yeah, so should I continue? Because I don't yet see it.
This is
yeah.
The practicing counsellors. I think they're coming a bit late to you. I think it's a bad connection.
Yeah.
Practicing
Right.
counsellors.
Okay. So the last piece of data we have is on practicing counselors, who have been practicing in the 6 metro cities of India. And this does show that although women may not be very well represented in the academia, especially in senior positions as professors and so on, but they are in a majority in the mental health sector, working as counselors and mostly in private practice. Yeah, can I go on to the next slide, please? So as I said earlier, this is only a snapshot and not really a comprehensive review, but it clearly shows an overwhelming number of women students. and at all levels, right from masters to MPhil to doctoral programs. And I have two arguments or two overarching observations to make, fairly straightforward and simple. One is the feminization of the discipline, and the second is persistence of sociocultural barriers. Next slide, please. So our data do seem to indicate a feminization of the discipline taking place, and this is in line with prevailing trends of gender segregated courses or occupations. And feminization also refers to concerns about devaluation of the occupation or course of study when large numbers of women enter the field. Our data does show a predominant representation of women students in psychology, and this has translated into entry-level positions, particularly in the academia. And the initial perception, especially in the early years of the discipline of psychology as science in the experimental tradition, is perhaps now giving way to psychology being perceived as a gender stereotyped major suitable for women in the field. This is witnessed by a lower footfall of men coming in, but these changing demographics throw up quite a few questions. Can I have the next slide, please? So there has been a change in the demographics, as you can see, and they throw up questions like, for example, if a similar trend persists, what will the profile of the field be like in the coming years? That would be interesting to watch. And second, the etiology of the relationship between status of the field and overrepresentation of women is a bit complicated and perhaps better accounted for by gendered socialization patterns. Specifically, men are frequently socialized to pursue prestigious occupations, including those that are more profitable, have better working conditions, and offer greater opportunities for advancement. Women, on the other hand, probably receive the message that they should take up less space by filling lower status jobs that may be considered as supplementary to the job and earnings of the male provider, who is considered to be the central or the key provider and breadwinner. Next slide, please. Now, there are two related factors in feminization of the discipline. The general perception is that the discipline is primarily related to health and education, and hence perhaps not masculine enough. There is also this perception, and again, this is based on our observations, that the men who do enroll do so as they wish to pursue careers in sports psychology or forensic psychology or cognitive psychology or neuropsychology, that are again perceived as belonging to the masculine domain, perceived as falling within the hard science model. But as I said, these are just observations as an insider in the field, as we couldn't get nationwide data on subfields of psychology and gender. The second factor is dearth of worthwhile employment opportunities in the field. In the academia, especially with the liberalization of our economy since the 1990s, the gradual withdrawal of state support to public funded universities and the rise of the private sector means social justice may not really be high on their agenda. And most jobs are in the mental health sector, and professional counselors are now in multiple settings of hospitals, schools, educational institutions, family courts, non-governmental organizations, helplines, that mostly they are in private practice. And currently, in the last 2 decades or so, despite the increasing prevalence of stress, anxiety, and depression related mental health concerns, and the increasing suicide rates, particularly in the 18 to 30 age group, there is a rising demand for psychological services. But despite that, the mental health sector continues to be characterized by relatively lower wages, is unregulated, and perhaps therefore may not appeal to men in a society that emphasizes the provider breadwinner role as primary for men. And conversely, emotional labor associated with nurturing activities and the healthcare professions may be perceived as more suitable for women. So the second factor is this persistence of socio-cultural gendered barriers in employment. And here what I would like to say is that socio-cultural barriers that hamper girls' education in school particularly have been extensively studied at the three overlapping levels of individual, institutional, and societal levels. But as we saw in the last 10 years, significant progress has been made in tertiary education in India. And in fact, the gender composition in psychology is favorably tilted towards women as students and as faculty at the entry level and in the profession of counselors. So this means that girls are able to make it to the university level, but afterwards they either drop out of employment or get concentrated in sectors characterized by relatively lower wages and therefore not appealing to men. So if rising female education is not associated with a commensurate rise in employment, it means that education appears to be playing other kind of roles. For instance, recent studies on indicate that upwardly mobile caste groups support girls' education, but not for their freedom of choice or for autonomy, but mostly to improve the family's social status and the girls' marriage prospects and so on. There is therefore a disconnect between gender parity in education and tolerance for women's autonomy and freedom of choice and decision making when it comes to career. And recent studies also indicate that the notion of compulsory marriage, the motherhood mandate, and the disproportionate burden of caregiving responsibilities continue to be key barriers that account for women's low workforce participation. Some studies have also demonstrated evidence of sexist attitudes in faculty recruitment, wherein the gendered stereotype of familial responsibilities perceived as being primary for women is considered to collide with professional responsibilities, and therefore they are perceived as less effective. Thirdly, there is the income effect. This is what economists tell us, where women with more education marry into richer families that enables them to withdraw from the workforce. Can I have the next slide, please? Lastly, I would like to take the example of this initiative taken up by the University Grants Commission, India's regulatory body of higher education, as a measure to address the invisibility of women in higher education management. This program ran for about 10 years, and its objective was to increase the participation of women in higher education management, to critically analyze the gender gaps and initiate gender positive measures. The initiative is, of course, not unique to psychology faculty, but I'm taking this example just as an example to demonstrate the value of interventions such as these. The initiative consisted of 5-day workshops, and women faculty across disciplines, across regions of the country participated. Around 2,000 such workshops were held and reached out to over 70,000 women faculty. And the methodology of the workshops was participatory, with key elements being self-reflection, critical awareness about gendered barriers to education, sharing of experiences, and building networks for overcoming challenges. And they adopted a training of the trainers model, aimed to develop a community of practice through collective learning. Unfortunately, no impact evaluation was done for this initiative, and the program had to be wound up in 2013 due to funding constraints. But the feedback received was very heartening and was extremely positive. Yeah, next slide, please. And wrapping up, I would like to conclude by saying that there is certainly a critical need for such interventions to promote leadership capabilities and for women from underrepresented socially disadvantaged groups for greater gender equity. And hopefully, such conversations will also stimulate research on identifying factors, individual, institutional, and societal, that contribute to decision-making processes related to career choices. Another area of research that is relatively underexplored is migration abroad for further education. Currently, Indians constitute the second largest share after China of the world's globally mobile students. So what do the migration decision-making and preferences indicate for women graduating in psychology from India to countries like the US and the UK would be an interesting question to investigate further. Finally, I would like to sign off by saying that mere inclusion of women is not enough, because that would be a very essentialist view. What is needed is critical awareness of gendered inequalities in order to make gender equality a concrete reality. Because gender equality cannot simply be a ghettoized as a women's issue only. It is an issue that concerns all. Thank you. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Aditi. You struggled there with the link, yes. And that illustrates just how many other issues there are in the world that prevent us actually communicating, which is, you know, technology is against us. But I think that's a really interesting talk. We're having some questions coming in. What we'll do is we'll deal with them at the end, as I've said. But that was really, really fascinating talk, and it's really interesting to see some of the findings that you presented, especially those in relation to the US, which other people might not have expected. So thank you very much, and I'm sure everybody will join me in thanking you. I think, if it's okay with everyone, because we've kept brilliantly to time, so that's good, we'll move on to our next speaker. So if we could have the first slide for Isabel, I'll say a little bit about Isabel and then she can go through, if that's okay. Thank you very much again, and as I say, we'll have questions at the end. Welcome. So we'll just wait for your first slide and then I'll say something. You also are very eminent but very modest. I'm sure you won't say everything there is. So we have Isabel's first slide. Thank you. Okay, so our second eminent speaker is Professor Isabelle Renier, who is full professor of social psychology at the Cognitive Psychology Lab, UMRC NRS, the number there, at Marseille University. She was the director of the Center of Social Sciences at the Science Faculty from 2014 to 2020, and was named a Vice President for Gender Equality in 2020, which makes her even more suitably to do this talk. Her research examines the influences of social stereotypes on cognitive performances, judgments and decision-making in various domains: maths, reading and memory, and populations. So she looks at children, young adults, healthy older adults and patients. She's published over 50 peer-reviewed journals and book chapters, so I'm really looking forward to her talk. Just a very different talk, but one that's very pertinent. So Isabel, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Pam, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a great honor for me to have the opportunity to present an overview of some of the research conducted in social psychology about how gender stereotypes, which are social and cultural constructs, can influence both cognition and behavior. Next, please. So in social psychology, we consider that social stereotypes are a kind of shared beliefs in a society, in a culture, about personality traits and abilities that characterize individuals due to their membership into specific social groups. And how can you can see below that social stereotypes lead to simplification, but it's their job, in fact, but also to overgeneralization and some distortions. And by the way, how you can see here for national stereotypes, you can see only men, but not women to represent a country. Next, please. Concerning gender stereotypes, maybe you know it, but in the 90s, there was a controversy with a talking Barbie doll that said that math class is hard. The sentence was removed. There was also a controversy with the president of Harvard University in 2005, who argued that men outperform women in math and sciences because of biological innate differences. But more recently, there was also a huge controversy with what this European Parliament member said. He said that, of course, women must earn less than men because they are weaker, they are smaller, and they are less intelligent than men. So they must earn less, that's all. So you can see how gender stereotypes can be dangerous because they are used by people who have got power in our society. Next, please. So here I would like to give you a very small, short overview of some kind of research in social psychology. And we've got at least two kinds of perspectives to assess the influence of social stereotypes. The first one is focused on how social stereotypes, and here gender stereotypes, can influence the targets of the stereotypes. And these stereotypes are able to influence how people will evaluate their cognitive functioning and then competence in a specific domain. The stereotypes will influence how they learn, and that will also influence their cognitive performances on the test and exam. This line of research is known as stereotype trait effects, and it will explain how these stereotypes can lead someone to perform below one's true potential. Next, please. The second perspective is about how the same social stereotypes can influence the perceiver. And in this kind of research, we were able to show how social stereotypes can lead people, can influence the way they evaluate the abilities of others. So they will influence their judgment and also the hiring decisions. And this field of research is known as discrimination. Next, please. So if we start with the first line of research, stereotype trait effects, Steele and Aronson explained and demonstrated for the first time that stereotype trait is a situation-specific trait that can occur in context when members of stigmatized group risk the possibility of confirming the stereotype about their group. And the fear of confirming the stereotype can interfere with performance in the stereotype domain and lead them to underperform in that domain. So as you can see in the figure below, each time someone is under stereotype trait, you've got some negative thoughts, negative emotion, and appraisal processes that will interfere with working memory resources that are normally used to succeed on complex task and test. So the consequence is that working memory is also dealing with the negative thoughts and negative emotions, the stress. And because of this added work, the result is underperformance, so a decrease in performance on complex cognitive tasks. Next, please. The first demonstration in the math domain was published by Stephen Spencer, Jan Quinn, and Claude Steele. What did they do? They took a very well-known standardized math test that is used in the US to select undergraduates at the university. And you can see here an example of a complex exercise from the SAT-M. So they took this test and they showed it to participants, male and female, at the university. For half of the participants, they presented the test as a difficult math test, just as it is said exactly in standard condition. And for the other half, exactly the same thing was said, but they added a small sentence which says, oh, by the way, on this math test, there is no gender differences. So it is the gender fair condition. So we can see the results on the next slide. In the standard condition, you can see that female undergraduates underperform compared to their men counterparts, but this difference disappears thanks to the gender fair instruction. And you can also see that women's performance is significantly better thanks to the gender fair condition compared to the standard condition. So a very small sentence, a very small thing in the context, in the situation, is able to change the performance of women. Here the decrease for men is not significant, but in many studies it does. It is significant. And I will explain it later. Yeah. You can change. Thank you. The same pattern of result were also obtained on children, and here you can see a figure that in fact is not at all a math test, but we made middle school girls and boys believe that it was either a geometry test or a drawing test. Next, please. So these are the results when we make boys and girls believe that it was a geometry test. Girls underperform relative to boys. It is exactly the reverse that is obtained when the same test is presented as evaluating drawing abilities. Next, please. Here we try to see whether the same pattern of results could be obtained on female at the top of math, science, and engineering education that are French engineering schools. So I don't know if you know that, but female at the top of MSc education are very underrepresented in France, but generally there are very highly talented female in math and engineering courses. So we choose here the Raven matrices. As you know, it is a very complex test. And we presented for half of the participants the logical reasoning ability test. And for the other half of the participants, of course, male and female, the same test was also presented as a logical reasoning ability test, but we also added the sentence, the gender fair condition. So we can see the results on the next slide. Okay, so just exactly the same as we obtained with children in the standard condition. Even the most talented female in math and engineering underperform relative to men, and this is the reverse we obtain thanks to the gender fair sentence. Next, please. I think it was important to show you also that the influence of gender stereotypes on performance is not only a matter of women. In fact, it is a matter of every group. And this study was very important because it demonstrates that everybody can suffer from stereotype threat effects each time the situation activates negative stereotypes against one group to which we belong. And here, what they did? They took white males with very high scores on the SAT-M. So imagine here we've got men who are very good at math, and when you challenge them with a very complex math test, they want to show that, oh, they are able to succeed this test. So you present them a very complex, very challenging math test in the standard condition, and in the stored threat condition, exactly the same test was presented, but a small sentence was added here. The authors make them believe that Asians were taking the same test in another classroom and that they are going to compare their performance. And when you are saying that, as you can see here, there is a decrease, a significant decrease in performance when the US male very good at math believe that they will be compared to Asians. And as you know, there is a negative stereotypes that says that US are not as good at math as Asians. Next, please. In fact, there is today a huge of publication about stereotype threat effects and about the underlying mechanism to explain how stereotypes are able to influence individuals' performance. The first thing is that today we also know that every kind of social stereotypes targeting competence in a specific ability domain are able to decrease everybody's performance. Next, please. And also, all this research was able to identify the underlying mechanism. And what we know today is that a stereotype threat situation can lead to impaired, decreased performance because the activated negative stereotypes in mind will increase stress, inflexibility, in using a wrong strategy to solve the problem, will increase interfering thoughts, will increase performance avoidance goals, and will decrease working memory capacity, which is absolutely necessary to succeed to complex tasks. Next, please. Also, there are many research that try to identify what kind of actions could be done in the classroom, in the real world, to avoid stereotype threat effects. So as you have seen before, the gender restrictions is quite efficient to make women perform as well as men at a math or logical reasoning test. But other strategies have been tested. And for example, we know that encouraging students towards self-affirmation is very efficient to make them succeed at the level of the true potential. Likewise, teaching women about stereotype threat can also make them succeed at math test and perform as well as men. Also, concerning a math test, Ramirez and Belloc in Science published that expressing writing, which consists in writing on a paper all the negative emotion and thoughts that we have in mind about the difficult matters we are going to take, is efficient enough to alleviate the stress and make a female concentrate on the test and succeed at it. And of course, I'm sure that you know also this strategy, providing role models in STEM fields and female peer mentors can help women succeed and also choose scientific fields for the future and for the professions. Next, please. So I would like now to present some results also quickly about the second perspective about how gender stereotypes can influence here the perceivers. When I say the perceivers, I mean, in fact, every individual, so you, me, who can have some stereotypes in mind, and having stereotypes in mind does not mean to agree with the stereotypes. It simply means having the stereotypes in mind because we know that in the society where we are living in, there are many other people who believe that, for example, men are better at math than women. So the simple things to know that is enough, as you will see, to be influenced by these stereotypes. And here, the research is showing that having stereotypes in mind can influence perceivers in the way they will evaluate the ability of others. So they will influence the judgments they are making and also hiring a decision. This field of research is known as implicit bias or discrimination. Next, please. Maybe you know it, but the first demonstration, empirical demonstration of gender discrimination against female in scientific field was published by Mosrekusin and collaborators in PNAS. So it is known as the study about the survey of Jennifer versus John. What is it here? So they selected a pool of professors in STEM field, in biology, chemistry, and physics. Here, professors who are used to making decisions about hiring people for scientific lab. And here they had to evaluate the application of an undergraduate science students for a science laboratory manager position. The evaluators were both male and female, and they were randomly assigned to either the name of a male or a female student. Next, please. The CV that discovered was exactly the same for every evaluators. The only thing that differed was the first name of the candidate, which was either John, a male, or Jennifer, a female, but everything was equal and the same. And then they had to evaluate the abilities and to say whether the candidate was could be hireable or not, and whether this candidate deserved to be monitored in their lab. So we will see the results. Next slide, please. Thank you. So you can see here the decision made by male evaluators, and as you can see on all the criteria, the CV of John is more positively evaluated compared to the CV of Jennifer. John is evaluated as more competent, as more hireable, and deserving more mentoring than Jennifer. The question that we can ask is whether we have exactly or not the same results from female evaluators. I don't know if you have an idea of the results. Maybe think about it. Okay, do you think the same, not the same? Next slide, please. The answer is exactly the same. Even female evaluators prefer the John CV. So on all the criteria, they evaluate more positively the CV of the male candidate compared to the CV of the female candidate. And the bigger difference was obtained, next please, on the salary that was proposed for this first job. And here again, the male is advantaged compared to the female. So what we can see here is that because the CV was exactly the same for all the evaluators, there is only one thing that can explain such differences in the evaluation, and it is gender discrimination against female, because there is no other objective criteria that we can rely on to explain such significant differences. Next, please. I also wanted to present briefly this more recent study, also conducted by Mosrekusin and her collaborators. And I think this study is very important because today, of course, there have been changes in the representation of women in STEM fields. We can conclude that there is some progress, but of course, equality is not there yet. And I think that the previous presentation also showed it. But here, what is interesting is that the authors focused on the profession, which is a veterinary profession, where equality is now well established since 10 years. So in veterinary profession, there are as many women as men right now. This was not the case 10 years before. 10 years before, women were underrepresented. But now it's over and we've got parity. So the question is there still gender discrimination against women in a profession where parity is there, equality is there. So what they did here is to replicate the previous study with a CV, the same CV, that differed only by the sex of the candidate. But here they added something very interesting. There are also questions, ask questions of the evaluators, male and female, about what they thought concerning the link between parity and gender discrimination. And what they discovered is that half of the evaluators, male and female, thought that, oh, because there is parity, of course, there is no more gender discrimination against women, because parity is there is no more problem. But the other half of the evaluators disagree with that and said, oh, it's not because there is parity today that it means that there is no more gender discrimination against women. Maybe we still have to be careful about that. And as you will see, the results are quite different depending on the beliefs of the evaluators, whatever their own gender. Please, next slide. So what you can see here is that it is the competence of the candidate that is evaluated here. So the CV of Mark, a male candidate, and the CV of Elizabeth, female candidate. So on the left, you can see the evaluation of the evaluators who believe that gender discrimination still exists despite the parity that is there in the veterinary profession. And what you can see here is that for this kind of evaluators, there is no difference in the evaluation of abilities of the candidates, so independently of their sex. This is not the same thing that we obtain on the right. You've got the answers of the evaluators, male and female, who believe that there is no more gender discrimination because there is parity. So those who are thinking that there is no more discrimination, they are discriminating because they evaluate less positively the female CV compared to the male CV. Next, please. And also here again, the bigger difference is obtained for the advised salary for this first job of veterinary. And again, the evaluator who are making discrimination are those who are saying there is no more discrimination in this profession because we've got parity. So these two experiments are very interesting because they both demonstrate that despite the same CV, we can be influenced by the gender stereotypes that make us believe that men are more competent than women. And because of this difference of supposed competency, ability, in the consequence, we are more willing to recruit the male candidates and to give him more money, more salary for the first job. Maybe that the difficulty with both of these studies is that there are experiments and that the scenario were fictitious. Next slide, please. So what we did with my colleague Tony Schmeder and Pascal Huguet is that we conducted a study on real evaluation committees. So we examined during 2 hours the committee of the CNRS in France, who represent the whole scientific spectrum from mathematics and particle physics to political sciences and social sciences. And we followed them during the normal course of annual nationwide competition for elite research position in France. What we did here, first thing, we make them take the implicit association test, which is a computer-based task that is able to evaluate the strengths in memory of gender stereotypes. And it means that with this test, we're able to know how much people associate automatically science with men rather than science with female. And we also had them to answer some questions about possible causes of gender disparities in science, exactly as did Moss Rakusin in the previous studies I showed you. And exactly as showed Moss Rakusin in the previous study, we also obtained 2 kinds of committees. half of the committees, and it was independent of the scientific fields, so half of the committees believe that it is not gender discrimination that today can contribute to explain the underrepresentation of female in science and on a higher job. And the other half of the committee said, oh, yes, we must still be careful. There is still probably gender discrimination that can contribute to this underrepresentation of female in the elite research positions in France. So we can see now the results. What's interesting here is that to examine the results, we computed a parity index, which is called the adverse impact, that takes into account the candidate pool, so the number of male and female in the candidate pool. And then we compare this ratio to the ratio of male and female that were recruited for the elite research position. You've got in yellow the decision of committee who believe that there is no more gender discrimination today in France to explain the underrepresentation of female in the scientific fields. And in blue, the hiring decision of committees who believe that gender discrimination is probably still a problem and that we have to be careful. Implicit gender bias, when it is low, it means that we've got here committee who in average have in mind a very low automatic association between science and men. And at the opposite, those who have a high score on the implicit gender bias, it means that these people strongly and quickly associate much more scientific fields with men rather than with female. So what we can see here is that there is a significant link between the implicit association test, so the implicit stereotypes stored in long-term memory, and what the committee believe in terms of gender discrimination. And here the results say that in the sections, so in the committees with low beliefs in discrimination against women, and it's half of the section, the stronger the implicit association is stored in memory, the less women are recruited and promoted. And in blue, this is good news, this influence does not exist in the committees with higher beliefs in gender discrimination. So when committees believe that there is still gender discrimination and that we must be careful, they are careful, even if they have also the same implicit gender stereotypes strongly stored in memory. So when they think we must be careful, they make careful decisions, and here parity decisions. Next, please. So I think that what is important with all the research I try to present you today is that it is important to try to implement research-driven policies to reduce the influence of gender stereotypes. And I suggest a paper that is very interesting, according to me, by Tony Schmader and collaborators. In this paper, it is well described that there is a big gap between research, scientific research in psychology, and its practical application. And it's a problem because today many structures, institutes, business, and so on want to implement actions towards equality, towards gender equality, but they do not use exactly as they should use action to train evaluators about implicit bias. And there are a lot of misunderstanding about the definition, about what is implicit bias, what is the aim of anti-bias training, and so on. So I think that we should encourage using research-driven policy and has to respect of this discipline to help us implement actions and use scientific results to do the good things. Next, please. There is, thank you. there is a very interesting paper written by Patricia Devine and collaborators that tested what they called a gender habit breaking intervention in STEM departments in the US faculty. And they showed that doing this intervention can increase by 18% the recruitment of female in scientific department in the university. So this intervention is made on 3 steps. The first one is to help people be aware of unintentional bias. So, for example, we can use as implicit association test. The second step is to explain them what are the consequences of this unintentional bias. So the idea here is to inform, thanks to active learning about these biases, how it can help sorry, but I've not finished. Previous, please. No. Previous slide, please. Sorry, I've not finished. Thank you. I was commenting the second step. And the third step is to train individuals to use some strategies to reduce the unintentional biases. And here also, it's like an active workshop where we discuss and present evidence-based strategies that can be intentionally used to counter implicit biases. And here what we have to keep in mind today is that awareness is necessary, but is not it is necessary, but we also have to make evaluators and people in general be motivated to use strategy, because even if we are aware of unintentional bias, but if we are not motivated to control them, the action will not work. Next, please. So on this basis, what we have done on my own university, we try to use research and findings of the research to implement new actions. The first one was designed for students and first-year undergraduates. So we have implemented a new teaching courses on gender-based stereotype threat effect in science to help women resist gender stereotypes influence on academic learning and performance. Next, please. The second action we have implemented is a mentoring program for women in science. The experience is ongoing right now. Next, please. The third action is a new policy of systematic training regarding implicit gender bias. And here we have 2 actions. We have a short training session and a longer training session. The short one is designed for hiring committees who are in charge of the annual competition for research position in my university. And the longer session is a training for lab, parity groups, and PhD students. Next, please. This is an overview of the short training sessions for hiring committee. So what we have to keep in mind here is that it is an action during the committee. That means when they are evaluating the candidate pool and when they are making decision about who they are going to hire for the position. So we are using here 2 things. We are using the implicit association test to make the evaluators be aware of the unintentional bias in their long-term memory. And then at the beginning of each meeting, when they are evaluating and discussing about the CV of all the candidate pool, we are showing them some video. And the video, of course, are also been tested by the research, and the video explain shortly how the unintentional bias can influence their own decision during the evaluation of applicant pools and during the audition of the candidates. And the aim of the video is to increase motivation to control for unintentional bias during a collective decision. This is a standardized action with participant rate, so we can see how many evaluators agreed to participate to this action or not, and we also conduct longitudinal analysis using adverse impact to evaluate the efficacy of the action of the short and long term. Next, please. This is an example of the video you can find. It is open source video. You can see the publication of Most Recusin, where you have, in fact, a pool of 12 videos you can use depending on the situation which is used. You have got also the video of the Zarka Institute that I think is well known today, and a very new video that was designed especially for the French context, which is a simulation of a committee for the hiring of researchers at the university, and it is especially well appreciated right now. Next, please. We're also using PPT to give example of research on this, because we must not forget that we have got in front of us in the committees scientific research. So we have to show them figures, graphic, and results to show what science have done on this, and to demonstrate the influence of gender stereotypes on their own decisions, even if there are very rigorous and objective evaluations. Next, please. So I must admit that we need some help, and we have some help in France and in the Europe context more generally. In the French context, since 2020, we've got a French recommendation. It is a national recommendation toward the hiring committees in the university, and to train them to avoid implicit gender bias during the process of evaluation. But it is only a recommendation. I think, according to me, the most efficient thing is from Horizon Europe, which is mandatory for every university and institution who want to get funding for research. Gender is now an eligibility criterion. So each university must have gender equality plan to be able to ask for European funding. And it's not all. In this gender equality plan, you've got 4 mandatory criteria, and one of them is action to develop gender competence, to tackle unconscious gender bias, and to raise awareness among people, evaluators who are making decisions. Next, please. That's all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Isabel, thank you. That was fabulous. So I think we've had some questions come in before, but also some questions that arose during the presentations. I'll take, if we could get Professor Odoti back up, if you're able to come show your screen. Are you, Vinda? I know your signal's quite bad. We'd like to see you, if you don't mind. If you only, yeah, if you can, then that would be really good. So my first questions really are probably to you. Would it be helpful to put the first slide up, which showed the poster for the thing, so that we're not, if that will be okay, Marie-Françoise, just the first poster, yeah, if that's okay. Okay, so Vinda, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. Can you get your screen, or is your signal?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. If you can show us, but if not, that's also fine. I'm going to ask you a question about affirmative action. In the United Kingdom, affirmative action is actually illegal. Did you say that affirmative action was something that in your context, in the Indian context, was able to be carried out in relation to women? Yes. Yes.
We do have a constitutional policy of affirmative action for socially disadvantaged groups, by caste, by ethnicity, by disability, and these kind of policies have been in place right from 1950s onwards, ever since we got independence.
So they are affirmative action. You are able to yes. I use the word discriminate difficult. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we do have affirmative action policies, and in fact, some of the figures I was trying to show you, I don't know whether it was finally visible or not. This was from a public funded university. What is very interesting is that there is, of course, a growing minority of men, which is men as students, which is in keeping with the general trend. But what is significant is that there is also an increasing representation of women from socially disadvantaged groups. Now, one of course needs to be cautious to interpret this as a trend because, as I said, we don't have nationwide data on gender and social disadvantage. But this certainly is a very welcome feature that a lot of women from socially disadvantaged groups are also making it to psychology education.
But I think if I'm correct, you said they're not actually making it into senior positions quite so fast.
Yeah, yes, that is at the level of faculty. What I was trying to say is that, in fact, it's a paradoxical situation. In the last 10 years, women, not only in psychology, but in all disciplines, have made significant progress in tertiary education. So girls are able to make it to the university. And we don't have that many very stark barriers to girls' education now. But the thing is, when it comes to employment, either there are certain socio-cultural barriers, like for instance, as I said, the notion of compulsory marriage, the motherhood mandate, the disproportionate burden of caregiving responsibilities, all of them still account for low workforce participation. So they are still at the entry level. So at the professor level, we find there is still a huge gap. But at the entry level, there is quite a large pool of women. So maybe in the next 10 years or so, these changing demographics will throw up, some interesting developments.
I mean,
So
interestingly, the professor, to be a professor, you've got to have been a junior researcher. So it's going to take you, as an old professor, I'm saying, you need people to come through. And so but it's whether there are actually still barriers, which I suspect there are, and I suspect they may well still be in respect to science. Can I ask you one more question that came in, Bindaya, that how would what you're talking about, which is very directly related to India, relate to Asia and more widely? Have you got any thoughts about that? And then I'll pass some questions on that I had for Isabel.
Yeah, I think the trend would be the same. See, what I spoke today is, of course, relevant to India, but the overall socio-cultural context is more or less similar in many of these countries, particularly Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. These are the countries where one would expect a similar kind of trends. So what is, again, as I said, I don't have the data to back me up, but going by observations, the same paradox would probably be evident even in these countries, that women are making progress in education, but when it comes to employment, women's workforce participation is very low. And that is precisely because of similarities in the socio-cultural context of gendered disadvantage, which is probably the same across these countries. So the gendered disadvantage means that women's family role is considered primary. These are again stereotypes, and the stereotypes are extremely persistent. There is a disproportionate burden of caregiving, or there could be the threat or actual exercise of violence and sexual harassment. All of these constitute barriers to women's employment, which are probably, the same across all these countries.
Okay, and one more very quick question before I turn to Isabel. This webinar is about gender equality in science. Is what you're describing more or less or similar in all disciplines or science? Because science is an area where traditionally it has been seen internationally, I think, as being particularly gendered.
Right. In fact, I don't know whether that slide was finally visible or not. I had made reference to women in STEM fields in India. And in fact, it is astounding that women constitute something like 42% in STEM fields, whereas it's only something like 32 or 33% in countries like the United States.
Yeah, we did have that slide. Yeah, we did. Yeah. And I was going to ask you that very question. It was, it was, I got it written down here. It was, it was startling, which is an interesting finding.
Right.
I mean, I'll move to Isabel if that's okay, and then we can have an open discussion. But just generally, a stereotype in the United Kingdom certainly is that actually people from the Indian subcontinent certainly are more inclined towards science. So if you were in a UK university, you would be anticipating that in the STEM subjects, if you were looking at ethnicity as a dimension, you would be expecting a higher proportion of people, including women, females, in STEM than you would non-Asian countries. So that's an interesting thing. I'll ask Isabel a question if that's okay. And it's again, they came in at all times. So Isabel, really first question, you've obviously done something in your university that's going to make a difference, hopefully. How does what you do translate to actions generally in terms of improving the way that we view science? So Isabel, if you don't mind.
Oh, sorry, you want me to explain how we did that in my university?
How you did that, but how would what you showed at the end, what could we take in terms of policy for this? How would international, or not just European, but international policy in terms of the actions that we might take from what you described?
I think that we should try to implement action to raise awareness about implicit bias and how they can influence our decision, even if we believe that we are very rigorous and objective in our decision making. Honestly, I believe that the intervention tested by Patricia Devine is a very promising action. But maybe that what we know now, because I try to implement it in my own university, is that the big difficulty is to convince the scientific themselves that they can be biased, because many scientifics consider that because they are used to make evaluation, they are not biased. And this is the most difficult thing. But the most difficult thing does not come maybe from those you could think about. I think that scientific from STEM fields are very open towards this such actions and about this research from social psychology, because they are discovering a scientific field that they do not know. They discover methods, statistics, which is quite close to their own activities. So they like it, and I really think that the efficacy of the action among scientific researchers in STEM fields is very good. The problem is coming from social science scientifics. Because there is still underrepresentation of female in university professors, even in social sciences and humanities in general. So there is still a big problem, and gender stereotypes, leadership gender stereotypes are very strong, and they can contribute to explain, at least in part, the underrepresentation of female in the highest research position, even in philosophy, sociology, liberal arts, and so on. And the difficulty is to train these colleagues to make them accept that they are also biased against women, even if they are females themselves. I think the difficulty is there, and they are not ready to accept this for now.
So the problem is, if we all hold stereotypes, and it's It's what we call in English the political correctness of not admitting that you've got a stereotype is actually preventing us moving forward. I couldn't agree with you more. Actually, there's another question coming for Isabel. I'm going to read it out so I get it correct. Do you have any guidance as to what is the best set of materials to include in implicit bias training, or do you have a recommendation for any such training that exists?
My recommendation would be to use two tools at the same time. The first one is, maybe you know it, is the Stroop task. Do you know it, the Stroop task? And this is a very useful tool because it makes people understand what is an automatic bias in memory, and that automatic bias can be controlled. And if we do not control them, they can make us provide a false answer. So, you know, the task is you've got something on the screen. It can be a word, for example, green, and you have not to read the word, but you have to say as quickly as you can and without mistake. You have to identify the color of the inker in which the stimulus is appearing on the screen. So when it is green, written in green, it's very easy. But if you've got the word green, but in blue, you have to say blue. But here you've got a conflict between what you are reading, which is an automatic activity, and the good answer, which is to pronounce the name of the color. So this conflict can make you provide a wrong answer if you do not make a control to inhibit a wrong automatic answers. So this is the first tool I use. And then I use, of course, the implicit association test to make people be aware that they can have the gender stereotypes strongly stored in their memory, even if they strongly disagree with it. So having this gender bias in mind is not a bad thing per se, is simply an automatic association that is the sign of a good functioning of the memory, because the memory is making heuristic, is making shortcuts and so on, and this is normal. It is not bad by per se. But using the Stroop task and the implicit association are good tools to be aware of that. But it's not enough. It's necessary, but it's not enough. It is the first step. The next step is to be motivated to make control.
Then, of course, people become resistant if it becomes a rule. So in my university, there's lots of rules about not having names on CVs and all those things. But you can tell that people feel a little threatened by that. They feel that they're not trusted in order to respond. And it is quite difficult because most people want to not be biased, but they can't do anything about what they know. We could all of us, everybody watching and everybody involved in, come up with those stereotypes. We could say what they are, but at the same time, it doesn't reflect what we believe. And I think what you know and what you believe is probably two different things. This is the big difficulty. But I think that we must use science and scientific results to try to achieve these goals. Because, for example, you were talking about blind in CV. Some research have shown that this is not very efficient because evaluators can find whether this is the CV of a woman of a man. And the consequence is that there is a kind of reactance in the decision that can be even more discriminating against the person. So only scientific results can help understand this. So, and this is a webinar about science. That's I mean, I agree with you. Vendara, how does the sorts of things that Isabel's been talking about, because you talked in a more broad level, how do your sorts of this data that you were showing, how do the ideas that Isabel came up with relate to the situation that you were talking about in India or in Asia or in the Indian subcontinent or Asia?
Yeah, as I said earlier, I think stereotypes, especially gender stereotypes, are a persistent feature of everyday life in India. and how does one, and I feel stereotypes are of course a psychological. So the how does one overcome gender stereotypes, I think is a long haul, but certainly it makes a lot of sense to study, to explore gender stereotypes,
and to use science to
can inform our policies, our programs, based on the kind of psychological research that we do.
Yes. So we're coming towards the end. We've just got a few minutes left. I'm just looking to see if there's any more questions in the chat. I'm just looking down here. Do either one of you want to say anything in addition to what you said? We've just got 30 seconds each. So Isabel, have you got anything you'd like to add?
Well, I think that, of course, I agree with Vindhya. Gender stereotypes, as any social stereotypes, are very persistent, resistant. But we've got today enough interesting findings on the table, thanks to scientific research, to help us fight against these stereotypes. And it's up to us, it's up to everybody to put some control and to simply open-minded and to try something else, because we tried many things till today, and I think it's now the time to try actions derived from scientific research.
Thank you very much. And Di, have you got anything briefly you'd like to add? I think we might have lost her. Yeah. Okay. I mean, there is one thing is that, yes, you're absolutely right, but there also, we can't forget the structural differences which prevent.
Sure.
We can only do so much. So I think the structural differences that are already there that are also acting at the same time. So if we could do as much as we can with the science on what we know, then we have to also completely. Sorry, Vindhya, did you want to say anything? I'm sorry, we've got a bad link. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know whether I'm audible. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to add that making people question their own stereotypes, their biases, through workshops, through what we call in India as gender sensitization programs. At least my experience with these kind of programs has been very positive and very heartening. And I know it's a very slow process to make people question their own stereotypes, reflect on them, and then see what kind of action they can take. But I mean, there are no shortcuts. There is no simple ways to make stereotypes just disappear. So my own experience with conducting gender sensitization programs across different sections in society has been very heartening. And people do then begin to realize, how stereotypes have been a hurdle in the way they look at gender and gendered questions.
Thank you very much. So we've just come to time. So I'd like to thank you both, especially for giving us such enlightening talks. And hopefully this is a conversation that will carry on. Use science to show what science can do. I think that's the message we should come out with. I'd again like to thank Catherine Jemmy, the chair of the Standing Committee for Gender Equality in Science, Marie-Francois for her excellent behind the scenes work, and also Carol Woodward and Lucia for facilitating this very smoothly. I apologize in the breakdown. That's the nature of international work. Broadband is not equal. It's different across the world. And of course, Carl Swain for doing it. So I'll say goodbye now. We'll leave the poster up, and I'd say to you all, look out for the next webinar, which I certainly shall be at. So thank you very much. Thank you.